You know, some stories begin with a prophecy, others begin with a war. But this one begins with a girl who made the worst decision of her life, or maybe the best. Honestly, even now, nobody can agree on which one it was. But I'll tell you this much. What she did that night changed everything. Not just for her, for an entire kingdom that didn't even know it needed saving. The rain fell like broken glass. Cold, sharp, and relentless. The kind of rain that seeps through wool and leather and bone until you forget what warmth ever felt like. The mountain road had turned into a river of mud, and somewhere in the darkness below the cliff's edge, the Valdris River roared like a hungry beast waiting for its next meal. Elena Morrow was 17 years old, 5 feet 3 inches of stubbornness wrapped in a patched cloak, and she was absolutely, completely, definitely lost. Wonderful, she muttered to herself, wiping rain from her eyes for the 100th time. Truly spectacular life choices, Elena. Take the mountain pass, you said. It's shorter, you said. And now you're going to die in a ditch, and nobody will even find your body because the wolves will. She stopped. Not because she wanted to. Because she heard something that didn't belong in the storm. A crack, a scream, not human, but hoarse. And then the unmistakable, sickening sound of splintering wood and something massive crashing through undergrowth. Elena stood frozen, rain streaming down her face, heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape before the rest of her got any stupid ideas. Don't, her survival instinct screamed. Whatever that was, it's not your problem. You're a baker's assistant from a village nobody's heard of. You have 12 copper coins, a loaf of stale bread, and absolutely no business investigating mysterious crashes in the middle of a storm. The logical thing, the smart thing, would be to keep walking. Elena had never been particularly good at being smart. She found the carriage at the bottom of a ravine, half submerged in the swollen river. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Black lacquered wood with silver filigree that gleamed even in the darkness, curtains of deep crimson silk now soaked and tangled in broken branches. One of the horses had already been swept away. The other lay still on the bank, its eyes glassy and empty. But it was the crest on the carriage door that made Elena's blood turn to ice. A silver crown wrapped in thorns. The royal seal of the Night Kingdom. Oh no, Elena breathed. Oh no, 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 no. Every child in every village knew the stories. The Night Kingdom wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and it was ruled by creatures that had walked the earth for centuries. Vampires, immortals, beings who drank blood and commanded darkness and viewed humans as something between livestock and entertainment. And their king, the Vampire King, was said to be the most terrifying of them all. They called him the Lord of Eternal Night, the Crimson Shadow, the monster who had ended the last human rebellion by walking through an army of 10,000 soldiers, alone. Run, every instinct screamed. Run and don't look back. But then Elena heard it. A groan. Weak, pained, and coming from inside the sinking carriage. The water was rising. In minutes, maybe seconds, whoever was inside would be underwater. And despite everything, despite the stories, despite the fear, despite the very reasonable voice in her head pointing out that vampires were immortal and probably fine, Elena found herself sliding down the muddy slope toward the wreckage. I am going to regret this, she announced to absolutely no one. I am going to regret this so much. The carriage door was jammed. Elena pulled until her shoulders screamed, kicked until her boots nearly broke, and finally resorted to using a broken branch as a lever. The water was at her waist now, cold enough to steal her breath, the current trying to drag her under with hungry fingers. When the door finally gave way, she almost wished it hadn't. Because inside, slumped against the crushed remains of a velvet seat, was a man. No, not a man. She knew that immediately, instinctively, in the same way a rabbit knows the shadow overhead belongs to a hawk. Everything about him was too much, too pale, too beautiful, too still, like a painting of something that had once been human but had evolved past it centuries ago. His hair was black as midnight, plastered against a face that belonged on ancient statues. His clothes, what remained of them, were the deep charcoal of thunderclouds, embroidered with silver thread that had probably cost more than Alina's entire village. And on his finger, glinting even in the darkness, was a ring bearing the same crowned thorn's crest. This wasn't just a vampire. This was the Vampire King. Aldrich Valen, Lord of Eternal Night, the monster from every bedtime story meant to keep children from wandering into the forest. He was unconscious, or dead. Do vampires die? Alina's brain was spinning too fast to remember. Leave him, the logical voice said, almost pleading now. He's a monster. He's the monster. If he wakes up, he'll kill you. If his people find out a human touched him, they'll burn your village to the ground. Just G.O. The water rose to her chest. The king didn't move. And somewhere behind that terrifying pale face, Alina saw something that made her hesitate, something that didn't belong in the nightmares. A cut across his temple, deep, still bleeding, black blood, not red, but blood nonetheless. He was hurt. He was helpless. For one moment, just one, he wasn't the monster from the stories. He was just someone dying alone in the dark. I am the stupidest person alive, Alina whispered. And then she grabbed the Vampire King by his coat and pulled. He weighed easily 200 pounds. Maybe more, probably more. Alina was fairly certain her spine was going to file a formal complaint and then secede from the rest of her body. But somehow, through mud and rain and sheer stubborn refusal to admit this was impossible, she dragged him up the slope, inch by agonizing inch, her muscles burning, her lungs screaming, her fingers leaving bloody scratches on the earth as she clawed for purchase. Twice she slipped. Twice, she nearly sent them both tumbling back into the river. Twice, she said things that would have made her grandmother wash her mouth with soap, and then possibly exile her from the family. But she made it. By the time she hauled him onto flat ground, Alina collapsed beside the unconscious king, gasping like a fish, covered in mud and blood, and what she really hoped wasn't anything else. There, she panted at his motionless face. I saved you, the most powerful being in the known world, saved by a baker's assistant who can't even afford shoes that don't leak. You're welcome. He didn't respond. Obviously. But now that she was out of the water and the immediate survival panic was fading, a new panic was settling in. What now? She couldn't carry him anywhere. She could barely move. And when the sun rose, if he survived until then, a vampire caught in daylight would burn. Even she knew that. But there was a cave. She'd passed it maybe 100 yards back, had dismissed it as too dark and probably full of bears. But now... Alina looked at the king's pale, perfect, terrifyingly still face. I hate everything about this, she informed him. Then she grabbed his coat again and started dragging. The cave was shallow but dry, and mercifully bear-free. Alina managed to get the king inside just as the first gray hints of dawn started bleeding through the storm clouds. She propped him against the wall, tried to arrange his limbs in something resembling dignity, and then sat back to assess the situation. Which was, in technical terms, catastrophically bad. She had no fire, no dry clothes, no food except the stale bread, which she definitely wasn't sharing with an unconscious vampire who probably didn't eat bread anyway. She was hypothermic, exhausted, and sitting 3 feet away from a creature who, if he woke up hungry, would likely drain her dry without a second thought. This was a mistake, she thought, shivering violently. This was such a mistake. Why did I do this? Why am I like this? Why couldn't I just? The king moved. Elena stopped breathing. His fingers twitched first. Then his head turned just slightly, and a sound escaped his lips, low, pained, barely audible. And then, impossibly, his eyes opened. They were silver. Not gray, not pale blue. Silver like molten moonlight, like coins at the bottom of a wishing well, like something ancient and powerful and hungry. Those silver eyes found Elena. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she was frozen, a mouse caught in the gaze of a snake. The king's lips parted. His voice, when it came, was like velvet dragged over broken glass, beautiful and terrible and wrong in ways that made her soul shiver. "You," he whispered, "you pulled me from the water." Not a question. Elena managed the world's smallest nod. The king stared at her. Those silver eyes were unreadable, ancient, holding centuries of secrets she couldn't begin to fathom. He was weak, she could see that. Whatever had happened, whatever had caused the crash, he was hurt badly enough that even an immortal was struggling. But he was still the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered. He could kill her. He probably should kill her. That's what vampires did, according to every story she'd ever heard. Humans who got too close, who saw too much, who touched what they shouldn't, they disappeared. Elena waited for the strike. For the flash of fangs. For the last thing she would ever see. Instead, the vampire king said something that didn't make any sense. "Why?" Elena blinked. "What? Why did you save me?" He sounded genuinely confused. Like the concept of a human risking their life for a vampire, for him, was so foreign it didn't fit into any framework he had for understanding the world. And maybe it didn't. Elena opened her mouth to answer. But before she could speak, the king's eyes rolled back, and he slumped against the cave wall, unconscious again, or maybe something worse. She should have left. That's what the smart person would have done. The king was unconscious, the sun was rising, and Elena had a clear path out. She could disappear. Pretend this never happened. Go back to her village and bake bread and never, ever think about silver eyes and impossible questions again. But Elena looked at the vampire king, helpless, wounded, alone, and she thought about all the stories she'd been told. Monsters don't ask why. Monsters don't look confused when someone shows them kindness. Monsters don't. She didn't finish the thought. Instead, she pulled her wet cloak tighter, pressed her back against the cave wall across from him, and settled in to wait. "You owe me an explanation when you wake up," she told his unconscious form. "And also possibly a new pair of shoes. These are definitely ruined." Silence. Rain. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of hooves. Elena didn't notice when she fell asleep. One moment, she was shivering and watching the cave entrance, and the next, she was jolting awake to the sound of voices outside. Voices and torchlight, and the unmistakable clang of armor. "The carriage was found a mile east, Commander. The horses are dead. The king is missing. Search everything, every cave, every hollow, every shadow. Lord Valen does not simply vanish. Someone took him, and when we find them..." Elena's blood froze. The king's guards, they were searching for him, and when they found her, a human, a commoner, alone with their unconscious sovereign, they would kill her. They would ask questions later, and the answers wouldn't matter, because she would already be dead. Elena looked at the king. Still unconscious, still helpless, still wearing that ring that marked him as the most powerful being in the Night Kingdom. A ring that was worth more than her life. A ring that could buy her safety, if she took it and ran. Her hand trembled as she reached toward his finger. "Take it," the survival voice whispered. "Take it and go. Tell them you found it by the river. Tell them you never saw the king. They'll let you live, maybe even reward you." Her fingers brushed the cold metal. The king's hand closed around her wrist. Elena's heart stopped. His eyes were open again, silver and sharp and fully aware. And though his grip was weak, there was something in his gaze that held her more firmly than any chains. Not anger. Not threat. Curiosity. "Running away," he murmured, his voice a ghost of its former velvet. "Or running to something." The torchlight was getting closer. The voices were getting louder. And Elena, trapped between the monster's gaze and the soldier's approach, made a decision that would change everything. She leaned in close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in those silver irises, close enough to smell rain and blood and something ancient like dust and starlight. "Your guards are outside," she whispered. "They're going to find you in about 30 seconds, which means in about 25 seconds I need to not be here." The king's brow furrowed. "You're leaving." "Obviously. Before they can. Kill me for daring to touch their precious king. Yes, I like living. It's my favorite hobby." Something flickered across his face. Something that might have been amusement if monsters could be amused. "You saved my life," he said slowly. "And now you're fleeing before you can claim any reward." "Correct." "Why?" That word again. Why? Like it was the most important question in the universe, and he genuinely didn't know the answer. Elena should have pulled away. The guards were right there, their torches casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, their voices growing clearer with every second. But instead, she looked into those silver eyes, ancient, powerful, lost, and she told him the truth. "Because," she said quietly, "I didn't do it for a reward." She yanked her wrist free. And before he could respond, before the guards could round the corner, before anything else could happen that would make this night even more complicated, Elena disappeared into the shadows. The last thing she heard, as she scrambled through the back of the cave and out into the gray morning light, was the Vampire King's voice. Weak, wondering, and somehow impossibly warm. Wait. But she was already gone. 3 days later, Elena Morrow returned to her village. She baked bread. She delivered orders. She smiled at customers and swept floors and pretended that everything was normal, that nothing had changed, that she hadn't spent a night in a cave with the most feared creature in existence. She told herself it was over. She told herself he would forget. She told herself that a vampire king had better things to do than wonder about a peasant girl who dragged him out of a river and then vanished before he could even thank her. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled and the shadows seemed deeper than they should be, Elena would remember silver eyes and an impossible question. Why? And she would wonder if she'd made the right choice. She didn't know that at that exact moment, in a castle carved from black stone and older than human memory, the Vampire King was wondering the same thing. She didn't know that he had ordered his guards to find her. She didn't know that artists were sketching her face from his descriptions, that scouts were being sent to every village within 100 miles, that he had stood before his court and announced something that had never been announced in 300 years of his reign. She didn't know that the monster from the stories was searching for her. Not to kill, not to punish, but to understand. In the great hall of the Night Kingdom, Aldrich Valen, Lord of Eternal Night, Crimson Shadow, the most powerful vampire to walk the earth, stared at a rough charcoal sketch of a human girl with messy hair and stubborn eyes. "Find her," he said quietly. His commander bowed. "And when we do, Your Majesty." The king didn't answer immediately. He was remembering rain, cold, pain, The certainty that he was going to die alone in the dark, and then hands, small and human and determined, pulling him toward the light. He was remembering a girl who should have been afraid. Who should have run? Who should have let the river take him and never looked back? But she hadn't. And she hadn't asked for anything in return. In 300 years, no one had ever given him something without wanting something back. Not allies, not servants, not even the few he might have called friends. But this girl, this impossible, infuriating human girl, had saved his life and then disappeared like morning mist. Why? He needed to know. "When you find her," the Vampire King said finally, "bring her to me." "And if she refuses?" Aldrich Valen looked at the sketch one more time. Rain-soaked hair, defiant jaw, eyes that had looked at a monster and seen something else. "She won't refuse," he murmured. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. And that uncertainty, that tiny crack in 3 centuries of absolute control, terrified him more than any army ever had. Somewhere in a small village no one had ever heard of, Elena Morrow sneezed over a batch of bread. "Someone must be talking about me," she muttered. She had no idea how right she was. Or that the most powerful being in the world had just made her the focus of his centuries-long attention. Or that her life, as she knew it, was about to change forever. But she would find out. Soon.